So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this seminar on European strategic autonomy, a perspective from Sweden. And I think more and more people are joining here, but now we have quite a group. So very welcome. Strategic autonomy is a concept that has gained kind of traction the last years, but it's also been criticized for being vague, even offensive or overambitious for Europe. And there's no consensus among scholars or member states on what the concept means, but it's usually understood as Europe's ability to play its own role in world politics, to manage its relations and dependence with external powers, and of course based on its own values and interests. And this, of course, affects key pillars of the European integration project, the relation between member states and their union, and the relations between the EU and external powers. So no surprise that emotions sometimes run high, including public spats between leading politicians such as the French president and the German defense minister some months ago. And from a Swedish perspective, the idea that the EU should be vested with some form of autonomy has for a long time been quite problematic. And the nature of these problems, of course, differ depending on how autonomy is used and understood. And if we start with the original idea of European autonomy, it related to the area of crisis management for about 20 years ago, and this challenged Swedish self-perspective as a military non-aligned member, and also our perspective of the EU as a non-military actor. 15 years later, in 2016, when we had a new EU global strategy, but also a quite unpredictable US president and an aggressive Eastern neighbor, the kind of security implications of strategic autonomy deepened. It was more about protecting Europeans and establishing autonomy in the defense industrial field. And this created new challenges for Sweden. Our ties to the US could be threatened, and our defense industrial interests could be threatened when our partners couldn't participate in the various EU funding schemes that were started. And since then, you could argue that the concept has been broadened and it's used way beyond the traditional security field. And we hear daily reports or suggestions of the need for autonomy in the digital sphere, in the economical sphere, health sphere, etc. And this broader version of autonomy is perhaps more about managing dependence or interdependence in the world. And it offers a new set of challenges. How to do with the industrial strategies that risk becoming more protectionist, and what role should the state have in the economy and in the functioning of markets. But as an EU member, Sweden has accepted an ambition towards strategic autonomy, both in this military sense and now in a more general sense. And I think the agreed compromise from last year in the European Council read that achieving strategic autonomy while preserving an open economy is a key objective of the Union. And as this concept of strategic autonomy seems to stick, the Swedish government has lately communicated that it's increasingly willing to take part in this debate and fill the term with substance. And that is really the point of departure for today's seminar. So what sort of strategic autonomy does Sweden want for the EU? Are the Americans still as hesitant to the Europeans being able to go it alone as they were like 20 years ago? And what are the main conflicts and developments in this field today? And we have a great panel to discuss these issues with us here today. We have Hans Dahlgren, now also a member of the panel, yes. The Swedish Minister for EU Affairs, and before that actually a long service in the halls of power, and with some positions really with insight into how this field has developed the last decades. We have Constanze Stelzenmüller, the Fritz Stern Chair of the Center of the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. Master explainer of anything European in the US and anything American in Europe. So you're very well set for this panel. And then we have Niklas Hellvig, who's a leading researcher at our institute in Finland, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and is right now leading a large comparative research project on strategic autonomy. We also have quite a large audience today, and I would really like to encourage all viewers and listeners to this webinar to send me your questions, either through the Q&A function here on Zoom, or as comments on the live stream that we are having on Facebook right now. And I'll try to bring as many of these questions as possible into this session and the discussion. And please help me to do that by making your questions short and precise and actually being questions. So with that said, I'll give the voice and the video over to Minister Hans Dahlgren, please.
Well, thank you very much, Björn, and thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry I was a little late. You know, my first computer here broke down, but since we now have also digital autonomy, I could change to another computer and get straight online with the rest of you. Well, this is a buzzword, of course, in the international debate, strategic autonomy, and not merely, I would say, a concept for theoretical discussions and policy debate, because as an ambition, if that's what it is, it could have quite profound implications for shaping concrete policies in virtually all policy areas. It is highlighted, as we've seen many examples of, in visionary texts from our heads of state or government. It figures in conclusions from the European Council, like the one that you just quoted, Björn, and it underpins some concrete legislative proposals that gradually become an integral part of our common acquis. But I must say, I have so far not met anyone, maybe I will do it today, who can give a clear and agreed definition on what this concept of strategic autonomy really means. And one is, so far at least, likely to find different answers on what it entails, depending on who you ask. But I guess most stakeholders would agree that it's about reducing our dependence on the rest of the world, or enhancing our capacity to act autonomously on the world stage. But what this really then would mean in terms of practical policymaking is a different story. And that's why I think it's important for us who are involved in policymaking that we try to shape a clear view on what we want it to be, and not least on how we mean it to influence the design of policies in which it occurs, because I'm sure that this notion is here to stay for the foreseeable future. I heard you say, Björn, that this concept originated quite some time ago in security and defense policy thinking. I understand it's been mentioned in various EU texts in these areas, as early also as in the global strategy from 2016. So it's not just from late October last year. And since 2016, we have, of course, seen some very significant geopolitical changes in our world. Of course, the transatlantic developments linked first to the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and then again the election of Joe Biden last year. The existence of a very dynamic China pushing forward its positions, and of course the pandemic, this catastrophe on a global scale that we have never experienced before since World War II anyway. And I think all these developments have served in various ways to explain the desire to lessen dependence on the rest of the world. Or if you want to say it more resolutely, take charge of our own destiny. And that reminds me, of course, of Boris Johnson in his campaign for Brexit, saying, with the keyword, of course, taking back control. I'm not personally sure that the Brits really have that much more control over events that concern them by leaving the European cooperation, but that's another story. As you said, in October last year, the European Council said that achieving strategic autonomy while preserving an open economy is a key objective. And I'll try to say a few words on what we in Stockholm make of this. Of course, I want to make clear that to meet the challenges of the future, we are absolutely convinced that the cooperation in the European Union can and should be deepened and strengthened in a number of areas, and that there will be new forms of cooperation that might be needed, and that our preparedness for future crises that we don't know which they are or what character they have, that needs very well to be improved. But we also know what we have and what we don't want to lose. We have a European Union discussion on the economy, on the internal market, on trade. And as you know, Sweden has always emphasized the fundamental values such as innovation and competition and openness to the rest of the world. That these are really key factors behind the progress that our societies have seen. And that will remain a starting point also for the future for us. But I also want to say that there might be a need for us to help the market in some areas, to nudge it in the right direction, as we say sometimes. And there might be a need for smart and selective measures to deal with new challenges or to reduce vulnerabilities. And I think the pandemic that we are still fighting is an instructive example. It has, I think, illustrated the power of European cooperation at the same time as it has showed the need for openness. It has also made clear to us that we need to review preparedness, warehouse capabilities, warehousing capacities to increase our resilience. I wrote an article in Dagens Nyheter, the Swedish daily, the other week, where I tried to list 5 areas where I think that this ambition of strategic autonomy could influence and should influence policies to build a stronger EU, and that still remains open to the rest of the world. And I'd like to say a few words about each of those 5 areas. But before I do that, let me tell you that much of my thinking, my own thinking here, is based on my own experience from helping my government to formulate Sweden's first national security strategy. It was published early in 2017. That was the first such strategy that we have had since the 1800s, I think. And so it was a rather new thing for us. And we tried to focus on those key areas where we found that Sweden is in a real need to strengthen our resilience to meet future threats to our security. And it's no surprise to you, I think, that the health sector, including a possible new pandemic, obviously was one of those sectors where we saw that kind of need. But let me mention where I see the areas for going forward in the direction that we are talking about here. And I'd like to start with the green transition. Obviously, we need to act together within the European Union to push for a global transition to climate neutrality and sustainable living. And I think our contribution to the summit that Joe Biden has called for yesterday and today is a good example of where we can show our what we can do. Through good framework conditions and selective support to sectors where the market simply cannot attract necessary investments, we can help as governments to create the conditions for the next stage of green technology development. And this particular instrument that we have, the important projects of common European interest, as it's called, the tool can be used in certain cases and should be used. And we have our own pretty good example of this, the battery manufacturer Northvolt that is now being established in Skellefteå up north and in Västerås in Sweden as part of the European Battery Alliance. That is an interesting and I'd say much needed business project that would not, I think, have been able to be created, or wouldn't have been possible without an extra push of this kind. So when we use state aid, it must be used to remedy a market failure where the market doesn't do enough and to bring about necessary change. And of course, in the field of the climate crisis, this is absolutely necessary. Obviously, it couldn't become the new normal. We remain firm believers in EU competition policy. We believe that state aid might be used in a smart and selective way, but it must be used in accordance with the regulatory framework that we have in place. Because we must always keep in mind that it is not the role of politicians to decide what is the best industry to develop for the future. We cannot identify and pick winners. We can never beat the market in doing that. That we must realize. Of course, we understand that not all member states have exactly the same views or nuances on this. So I'm sure the discussion will continue within the EU. We will continue to be on the side where we have always been on this. My second field of example is the digital development. Sweden is said to rank as number 2 in the world when it comes to generating technological unicorns, which is positive and gives us a reason to be pretty proud, but doesn't mean that we can become complacent. For the Spotifys and the Minecrafts of the future to emerge, we have to have the right conditions in Sweden and in the EU. So we are investing heavily now in broadband expansion, which is a must here, and in the connected systems, and also, of course, research and development in artificial intelligence. And we need a truly digital single market that promotes innovation and progress, at the same time as we stay open to the world and avoid building some kind of digital fortress Europe. That must be avoided. So we will continue to work to facilitate for data to flow across national borders, both within the EU and with partners globally. My third focus area would be to enhance our crisis preparedness. I already mentioned the pandemic, which exposed really how vulnerable some of our supply chains are. Many life-saving goods and the components of goods are produced far away and reach us on a just-in-time basis. But there are areas where just-in-time is simply not secure enough. And that's where we are now expanding the EU's joint storage of important resources, such as personal protective equipment and medicines, and I think ventilators as well. We have one of those storages being built up also here in Sweden. But while doing so, we also need to remind ourselves that it's really impossible to know what the next crisis will be and what resources will be needed then. So in parallel, we therefore need also to promote broadened supply chains, both inside and outside EU borders. The fourth area of priority I want to mention is fair competition. I mean, if the single market is to function effectively for all EU citizens, then companies must compete on the level playing field. And we cannot allow companies in one part of our union to use hazardous working conditions or outright wage dumping in order to undercut Swedish jobs or European jobs generally. So one effective way to counteract this is by having joint EU initiatives for knowledge transition and increased competitiveness. Finally, Björn, an area I know is of interest to you, the EU foreign and security policy. That's absolutely a voice that also needs to be strengthened. And perhaps introducing the use of qualified majority voting in certain areas of foreign policy could make the EU a more forceful player. I hope so. It's also important to work closely together when it comes to implementing our agreed foreign policy decisions. Sometimes that leaves a lot to wish for. And we need to strengthen our capacity to manage our own security. But we must also not forget that security is not built unilaterally. You cannot do it just alone. I think Björn, I had the privilege some time ago now to work with Olof Palme in the early 1980s. He chaired then something called the Independent Commission on Disarmament and Security Issues, the Palme Commission. It said it was produced a report called Common Security, a Guide to Survival. And I think this concept of common security is still as valid as ever, because deeper relations with others, including outside the EU, of course, are necessary if we are to have a secure world that can really be said to have a common security. Now, passing on to a conclusion of all this, I think by pressing on for reforms in all these 5 areas that I mentioned, we also need a stronger EU, while we at the same time try to safeguard the kind of principles that have been always a basis for our union: openness, innovation, and free trade. We believe that we have in Sweden a pretty good picture of what has made Sweden and the EU move forward in a good direction during the past years. And we will try to do the same in the future, to strive for a smart and selective approach to all this discussion of strategic autonomy. Cautious and constructive. We will try to be helpful in the joint debate together on what will develop our union best for the challenges of the future. So that's what I wanted to say initially, and I'd be very interested now to listen to the other panelists and their comments. Thank you, Björn.
Thank you very much, Hans Dahlgren. I think I actually directly shift over to the first one of our excellent commentators and discussant, which is Niklas Hellvig, to inform us about the concept of strategic autonomy. Perhaps you could actually bring about this definition that was lacking and that could unite the member states, Niklas, and also comment on what you read into the Swedish perspective. But please, over to Helsinki.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I would be happy if I would have a definition really that could unite all the EU member states behind the concept of strategic autonomy. I have my own definition, but and I come to that in a moment, but I think really we are at a moment in the debate where member states interpret strategic autonomy in a different way and face some tough choices on different policy fields to implement the concept. But thank you first, Minister Dahlgren, for this initiative and for this presentation, and also for your op-ed a couple of weeks ago. A very interesting read, and I would recommend it to everyone who's interested in the strategic autonomy debate in the EU and outside of the EU. To read it, because I think it's a very interesting and valuable contribution. And in general, I think it's a good idea if the Swedish government now is trying to influence this debate in Europe, because as Minister Dahlgren already mentioned, this debate is here to stay. It's not going away. And the question is not if the EU, Europe should be strategic autonomous. The question is, how do we get there? What are the steps to be taken? And in that sense, I think there are some really valuable suggestions just in the presentation and also in the op-ed. So it was already mentioned, you know, how far we got already in the strategic autonomy debate in the last almost 30 years, from the St. Malo summit to the 2016 global strategy of the EU, and also recently in connection with the COVID-19 pandemic, a much more broader definition of strategic autonomy. But I think there are really some drivers in today's world that are very different from 25 years ago, right? That are really propelling this strategic autonomy debate. First, the increasing competition between China and the US, which risks actually a decoupling between the two economic areas, where we could be, as Europe, be caught between a rock and a hard place when it comes to standardization, when it comes to expert markets. We know the whole Huawei debate and the whole Google debate, and whether these two economic spheres are decoupling from each other. Then there's this increasing speed of technological transformation, where we just have to keep up when it comes to the digital transformation, when it comes to artificial intelligence. You mentioned battery technology. And this technological transformation really impacts our industries and our societies when we think about the future of labor and the future of work. And the third driver that I see is that global interdependencies are not purely benevolent anymore. That states use interdependencies actually to advance their geostrategic interests. Yeah? Sanctions are a good example, or in particular the extraterritorial sanctions of the US on Iran under the Trump administration. So interdependencies today in this globalized world are carrying risks all of a sudden. So strategic autonomy is and that is my definition, about managing those interdependencies. We cannot completely become interdependent, completely independent, sorry, but we have to manage the interdependencies that we have and weigh the benefits against the risks and adjust our policies accordingly. And how we do this is seen very differently across European member states. I mean, I think France is the example on one side of the spectrum, you know, because of its strategic culture, because of its political economy. It supports an idea of strategic autonomy that focuses on self-reliance and also focuses on the more protectionist elements of strategic autonomy. Yeah, on the military side, there are strong ideas about independent EU defense capabilities and strong support of EU defense industries. And on the economic side, well, they are more comfortable with the idea of state intervention and protectionism. When we go to the other spectrum, other end of the spectrum, we see maybe the Baltic states, Poland, or if the UK would be still part of the EU, we would also put the UK in that basket of states that see strategic autonomy from a very instrumental perspective. They want to see concrete results. What are the deliverables that come out of such an agenda? On the military side, for example, it's about the 2% goal, and are we as Europeans spending more on defense? On other areas, for example, the single market, it's about making progress when it comes to the digital integration and the digital single market, and there's a lot to be done, as you already mentioned in your intervention. So they focus really rather on where can we deliver. And I think then in the middle of the spectrum, there's a whole number of countries. I would put Germany in there, I would put Finland in there, and I think I would also put Sweden in there. And these countries, they have recognized that the world has changed. They recognize that the EU needs to do something, like you also mentioned. But they are also very cautious about how to go about these changes. They have the close defense ties with the US, and in case of Germany within NATO. In the case of Finland and Sweden, it's bilaterally, of course. They have the defense industrial ties, and they benefit a lot from open global trade and are export nations and have a lot of intermediate good in the industry. So, and they are very cautious. And I think in that way, it's a good way for Sweden to be proactive, because these two political debates are not one maybe at one side of the spectrum or on the other side of the spectrum, but when you're in the middle of this political debate, there's actually the position where you can moderate the discussion, where you can influence the discussion, and maybe get the two sides to communicate with each other and find a positive vision about strategic autonomy. And one thing I want to underline is that, and I said it already before, but we should stop thinking about strategic autonomy as just independence. Autonomy through protectionism, through cutting off or bringing supply chains back home, for example. Autonomy through protectionism is just one way to reach strategic autonomy, I would say. There are other ways as well, and those were also expressed in your contribution. It's also about providing the economic and political basis at home to be a strong actor abroad. For example, you mentioned different industries. You mentioned the digital market as one key area, and then so there's protectionism. There's like the support of economy and political foundation at home, and then there's this third way, which is the external, the international engagement and shaping the international politics in a way that they suit European interests and values, and or at least are favorable to them. And there we see a lot of activities on the side of the EU, for example, with regards to the reform of the World Trade Organization. That's just one example, but really also to see how can we tame this international competition, especially between China and the US, so that the global environment is more suitable for our interests and needs. I want to end on a point on that, where I want to highlight that we are actually facing quite difficult choices. You mentioned, and I think both of you mentioned already, this idea of open strategic autonomy. And it sounds quite nice as a word concept. You know, you help those that want to be strategic autonomous, but you also highlight this openness. But there is a trade-off between openness and strategic autonomy, and there are hard choices to be made between those two concepts. And this is where we actually need a discussion and a debate within Europe. Just to give one example, I think about climate protection and the discussion about the CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. On the one hand, we want to be strategic autonomous, and we want to promote this idea, obviously, of carbon neutrality, and we want to prevent carbon leakage, right? So that is a strategic autonomy idea. But for that, we might have to actually take a step back in this openness and introduce this mechanism of a tax on high carbon products. So that doesn't go well with this idea of openness, right? So there are difficult conversations, and these conversations are currently held in the member states. Do we want to use, for example, a trade instrument to promote our interests and values here, an example of the climate protection? And I think, these conversations will go on, and we face difficult discussions in each policy field, and that is what we're going to see in the years to come. And yeah, that's where I end my first remarks.
Excellent. Thank you very much for broadening our understanding of this concept and how it's used in some of the conflicts we are facing right now. I think we jump directly over to Constanze sitting in Washington. You heard here about the Swedish perspective being presented as cautious but constructive, and perhaps that could also apply to the new US perspective on European autonomy after years with more kind of fast and furious reactions, but during the Trump years. But please, Constanze Stelsmuller, how would you frame this from American perspective? What views are there on European strategic autonomy, and what do you think Biden will change in this perspective? And also, thank you for being with us this early in the morning.
No problem. The sun is shining outside. It's a lovely spring day in Washington, D.C. I had obviously much rather be in Sweden, but since that's currently not an option, I'm grateful that we have this kind of technology. Also, I never let pass, as you know, never let pass an opportunity of speaking in Sweden without mentioning that I am a life member of the Swedish Academy for War Sciences, which, as I like to think, practically makes me Swedish, or at least would give me a right of asylum. On the Biden administration in Europe, some of you know I've lived in Washington and worked at the Brookings Institution now since 2014. So I have the entirety of the Trump era under my belt, which has been exciting, sometimes more exciting than one absolutely needed, but very instructive. And I indeed have some things to say about the Biden administration and its relationship with Europe. We, I think, all have vivid memories, not to say PTSD, of the Trump administration's attitudes to Europe, which were fundamentally hostile. That said, they were also hostile to NATO. We learned from the Bolton book just how close President Trump was to taking America out of NATO. And some of you will also recall the famous speech that then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave in Brussels on December 3rd, 2018, where he explained that the EU might have to sort of take itself apart or be taken apart by its member states because it no longer served a constructive purpose. That was the general attitude towards the European Union here. And of course, there was also the specific point of view of the president, who thought that the European Union was essentially a front for German commercial interests. Add to that the sort of strong ethno-nationalist proclivities of the Trump administration, which made it particular friends of the Hungarian government. And that sort of combined all of it to create something of a perfect storm for the Europeans. So I think one could be excused for thinking that with the Biden administration fervently transatlanticist and pro-EU as it is, that we are now back in a happy state and everything is good. And I'm here just to tell you that that's not the case. And I'm not saying that because I have any inclination to join into the chorus of Cassandras in Europe who say, oh, you know, the margins of this elections were so narrow in the House and in the Senate, and the majorities will flip in the midterms, and then we will be back with something, you know, like the second term of Obama, where there was a House and Senate majority against the president, and they couldn't do anything. That is not my point, and I think I'm at this point a little less pessimistic on the midterms than I might have been a couple of months ago. No, my point is an entirely different one, and I think it is one that should be. I'm not sure that this understanding has sunk in European capitals, which is why I, as the French would say, j'y tiens. I think this is an incredibly serious point to make. And that is, although this administration is full of committed transatlanticists and Europeanists who have affection, knowledge of, connections with, friendships in Europe, although this administration understands that the relative and absolute power of America in the world has changed, although this administration does not, unlike its predecessor, think that America can decouple from globalization, and although this administration understands that Europe, and the European Union in particular, brings to bear very important power assets that are not just nice to have legitimizing add-ons in great power competition, but are essential for the pursuit of American interests in a world of weaponized interdependence. There is still I think, a conceptual void at the core of this administration's Europe policy. I'll explain that in a second, but the last point I want to make here, which I will also then go into in greater detail, is that I do not see European capitals contributing to filling that void. I think that this administration is actually in many ways bending over backwards to reach out to Europe. And I do not see the Europeans doing the same thing. In particular, I do not see my own country, Germany, doing the same thing. And that, I think, is, I have to say, an astounding failure to understand just how little time we have and how urgent the need is to find a new basis for the transatlantic relationship. Now, let me try and go into a little more detail on these points, and then I will shut up, so we have time for Q&A. On the conceptual void, I think that this administration has done some rather odd zigzagging on the Russia crisis, on the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and specifically on the treatment of Navalny. It has zigzagged on Nord Stream 2 and a couple of other issues. And I think that shows to us that that there is no real sense in the NSC or the White House of what they want the future of the Eurasian continent to look like. My suspicion is that they haven't done the intellectual work of sitting down and saying, there are futures A, B, C, and D, and A and D look good, but B and C look really terrible. And what can we do, and how can we work with Europeans or nudge them to prevent this from happening? This I am not seeing, and I think that that's a problem for us. And again, I don't see us contributing to it. In other words, the attitude here is benevolent. There is a great will to reach out and work with us, but there is no real sense of the ultimate purpose of this cooperation. And what that means is that there is a real risk that all of us will get caught up in conflicts over what I would call the distractions, the epiphenomena of the relationship, such as the Chinese-European investment agreement, such as Nord Stream 2, which I think are capable of pragmatic resolution. But but only and only if we see the larger strategic issues that we really have to deal with. And as long as we don't do that, the Russians and the Chinese have a wide open field to interfere, to distract us, to split us, which as far as I can see, they're doing every single day. The other reason why I worry about this is obvious to you, is that we are now currently seeing the two key countries of the continental Europe, which is Germany and France, going into extended election campaign mode with clearly a political mood that's very fragile, very introverted. I'm not saying that there is only bad things on the horizon, but I think that both Paris and Berlin are likely to be extremely introverted for the next year or so. And again, that leaves key capitals unwilling, unable, or too distracted to attend to these larger strategic issues. Which is why it is so important for countries like Sweden and others to come in with ideas and to at least know what futures they want for the European continent and for the transatlantic relationship, and to decide for themselves and then discuss with others what decisions need to be made to shape them. And let me end with a final point on on European strategic autonomy. I'm personally very agnostic on this concept. I think that the maximalist version of this that you can hear from Paris and other places strikes me as unrealistic. But I think that an American benevolence combined with a very, very strong strategic prioritization in the direction of the Indo-Pacific means that there is a great deal of interest, even among benevolent American friends, for us to get our own act together and to sort out our own problems without asking for American help all the time. That's what European strategic autonomy means for Washington. If we can get that done, then this capital is in favor of it. Yet at the same time, they don't want us. I think they don't, well, they don't want us to, and let me put this differently. I think a notion, I think the real temptation in Europe, particularly in Berlin, is not strategic autonomy, it's greater Switzerland. It's the idea that we can all be neutral in great power competition. The idea that we can somehow decouple from an America that bullies us, that wants to use us, that, you know, where the Trumpism will just come back, and that we can keep the Russians and the Chinese out. And I think that that's an illusion. I think that that kind of neutrality means in the end a choice by not choosing, and that choice will then be Russia and China. And I don't want to live in a Europe or be the citizen of a Europe that ends up having Russia and China as its protectors, but under very, very different conditions than when we had a transatlantic relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constanze, for that wake-up call from Washington, and I'll return to you soon with a question coming in here. I'll just like to repeat to the audience that please keep on sending questions. I have already lots of them, but I'm happy to take more. But I would just like to give the opportunity to Minister Hans Dahlgren to kind of comment back from what you've heard here to different perspectives on strategic autonomy and the transatlantic relations before we move on with questions here from the audience, if you will, please.
Well, thank you, Björn. First, it's been a very interesting time to listen to both Niklas and Constance, and thank you for your contributions. Just one point for each of you. Niklas, you said at the end that there is this divide between strategic autonomy and openness, an open economy, and you have to balance it in one way or another. Of course, that can be argued in that direction, but you can also argue that it can be combined. And I'm more inclined to be on that side of the argument, because I do believe that we can be better in the European Union on strengthening our preparedness for future crises. For example, in the health sector, by protective equipment, medicine, etc., and making sure that these items are available, even though we don't close the doors to making business with these particular matters, also with other countries outside Europe. And I think that goes also in other areas. We do not have to become a fortress Europe just because we strengthen our own capability to meet future crises in a better way than we do today. The climate crisis, or having access to food and energy sources, etc., in time of crisis. One can do that while still having maybe a more diversified chains of supply from other countries, but I'm not all that sure that we can define this as just opposites. On the carbon dioxide adjustment mechanism, it's absolutely right that this is not an easy mechanism to embrace for those of us who believe also in open trade. It is true that this can be construed in various ways, and we have to be very careful when we start experimenting with this, so that we try to make it as much compliant with our basic principles of open trade as possible. I was very interested to listen to Constance's experience about the Trump years. I had the chance to accompany my prime minister on a visit to the Oval Office some years ago.
Condolences.
And he then very clearly explained his vision of what the European Union was all about. And it was quite different from my own view of what the EU does. It seemed like his take on the European Union was more like something that has been created to make life difficult for America. And that is, of course, not our idea. I would say we in Sweden, not being a member of the Atlantic Alliance, not being a member of NATO, still having a good cooperation with NATO, we are very firm on the transatlantic link. And we are absolutely welcoming the attitude of President Biden. I was myself present at the meeting that the president had with the leaders of the EU some weeks ago over the video screen. And I can agree with you that I couldn't even in my fantasy find a better welcome statement from him than he read himself. And I'm sorry if we have not responded in the right way to that. I think when we have discussed it in the Swedish cabinet, we have really tried to make as good use as possible of these new opportunities for exchanges with the American administration. There has been even an over-enthusiasm among my colleagues to try to fly over there and get contacts with their American counterpart. So we have to coordinate this in a manner. I mean, we are not the only country in Europe that has decided. So I'm sorry to hear that you seem to think that we are not doing enough there in generally speaking in the EU. So if you have any ideas as to what we could do more as a union, I'd be very glad to listen to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans Dahlgren. That was a think tanker's dream, and you will be able to put forth your ideas soon, Constance. I'll just read up a few questions here, and I think you can all kind of chip in on them. I think we'll start in where we were on the transatlantic relations. I have one question here, which is Sweden seems to worry that the development of a Plan B, European provision of European security, will threaten Plan A, transatlantic provision of European security. But isn't the real threat to the Plan A that a few thousand voters in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin can decide on its status and Europe can just hope for the best every 4 years? Is this sustainable? And what will Sweden do about it? That was one question. And on a similar, or at least on the transatlantic theme, I also have a direct question here for Constance from our friend Hanna Ojanen. Would the conceptual void be visible also in other questions than transatlantic relations, for example, internal US matters or US-Russia relations? So I'll head back to the full panel with these kind of transatlantic questions, and the first one more relating to strategic autonomy in the defense field, and I guess a question to Hans Dahlgren. But who wants to start?
I could say a word about Pennsylvania. I mean,
Plan A and Plan B.
Plan A and Plan B. No, of course, we have to be aware in Sweden and in the EU and everywhere that the United States is a democracy, and there are political forces that are a strong play in all the kind of directions. I mean, the very fact that Joe Biden won this presidency with a pretty good majority of electoral votes, but it could have gone the other way. It's no guarantee that it won't go that way 4 years from now. So we have to prepare for that as well. I take that very seriously, that this is less than 3 years from now. That could be a totally different administration, and of course one has to also consider that, but prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Thank you.
May I just ask you on that theme, like in the preparation, for example, now on the strategic compass and the new kind of ambitions put forth for European security policy, does that mean that Sweden will be more in favor of kind of strengthening these elements, for example, the mutual defense clause and perhaps with exercises and more doctrine around that?
Oh, I couldn't go into the specifics of that. We have an open attitude to all this kind of cooperation, as long as it's on the basis of intergovernmental cooperation. So I don't rule anything out in that direction, as long as we keep it intergovernmental.
Thank you. Constance, please, did you have a...
Sure. There are two questions to me. I think from Minister Dahlgren, what more should the EU do? And then Hanna's question on the conceptual void. Let me start with the first one. I have to say, I was thinking especially of my own country, Germany, where I think if you look at the response, for example, the speech of Chancellor Merkel in response to President Biden at the online Munich Security Conference, or if you look at Foreign Minister Maas's speech that he gave at Brookings on March 9th. All of those are sort of strong on positive emotions and very short on specific suggestions. In other words, there is simply an asymmetry between the Washingtonian side here and at least the German side. And to me, that is I think that is potentially incredibly damaging. I think that at this point there is an understanding in Berlin of just how politically damaging Nord Stream 2 and the Chinese investment agreement are. But I think a lot of people also understand that there are pragmatic solutions for both of this. There are pragmatic ways to deal with the pipeline there, and the Chinese-European investment agreement is in reality a small symbolic win for Beijing, but it in no way prevents a larger strategic conversation with America on cooperation about Chinese behavior, worldwide and in Europe. What I'm not seeing, and that really concerns me, is whether we have any concept of how to deal with the fact that a Russian government that is leveraging itself from a fairly weak position and a Chinese government that is in many ways overplaying its hand are still intervening very assertively, indeed aggressively, within the European physical, political, and digital space. And I think we all know that if we don't do that, then the question of strategic autonomy is moot. It is a pointless conversation to have as long as we are unable to react as one on this kind of thing. And now I'm not suggesting sort of a peculiarly Teutonic conception of a strategic Gesamtkonzept. Yeah? I'm not saying we all need to have a perfectly thought out 360-degree strategy on this kind of thing. What I am saying is that I think it would be useful under the circumstances to have agreed talking points on certain situations, to make it clear that there is no ray of daylight between Washington and European capitals on the treatment of Navalny, on Russia's behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine, and on Chinese diplomacy in Europe. And I think then if we, that's as far as I'm concerned, I think low-hanging fruit. And every second that we don't do that is seen as an encouragement in Moscow and Beijing. Conversely, if we do it, I think that is a sort of, a meeting point, a sort of strategic meeting point from which we and the Americans and we Europeans with each other could then work outward to deal with the larger strategic questions. That's a sort of concrete, do it now suggestion. And I think that is, that strikes me as a no-brainer, as they say over here. Now, on Hannah's question of the conceptual void, no, I think that this administration, interestingly, if you were here in Washington, you know that sort of half, you knew last summer that half your friends were engaged in very large working groups writing papers for the Biden administration. And it's become clear from the energy with which this administration has put out government decisions day by day by day, is that this administration is unusually determined, unusually well prepared, and is actually undertaking a process of domestic reform that I think has a parallel only in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, which is remarkable. On the foreign and security policy side, that is matched, I think, most clearly by the strategic take this administration has on China. And frankly, if you look at the interim security guidance, which came out a couple of weeks ago, which is only a couple dozen pages long, that gives you a very succinct and very good idea of what this administration's foreign and security policy priorities are. But the problem is, I think for us, that China is the overriding priority, and that Europeans, while loved again, are considered useful or not useful to the degree with which they can contribute to either assisting in this purpose or keeping America's back free, as it were, in the Middle East, Northern Africa, and with regards to Russia. And I think that responding, that's what I meant by conceptual void. And I think the zigzagging of this administration on the Russia issue, I think shows that they hadn't fully thought this through, and that they don't have a fully developed policy strategy. That assessment, I think, is supported by the staffing problems that they have had. And the fact that there is no Russia-Europe czar in the same way that the Trump administration had with Fiona Hill, my colleague, or that they have with Kurt Campbell and Rush Doshi and the NSC on China. Yeah. Europe and the Eurasian continent is clearly a secondary priority. And I think we need to decide in Europe whether we want to be part of the helping to solve problems, but if possible on our terms, or whether we want to be part of the problem. And as my colleague Tom Wright likes to say, the people like Jake Sullivan the administration is divided into pessimists and optimists with regard to Europe, and that Jake Sullivan tends to be more of a pessimist. And I think it is incumbent upon us to prove that there is no reason to be pessimistic, but to provide concrete problem-solving solutions for this. And that, I think, also means overcoming our own, what a friend of mine has called the narcissism of minor difference in Europe. Not hanging back, putting aside the minor sort of tactical distractions and looking at the big picture, and particularly understanding how little time we have and how great the pressure is. Right, that's it, as far as I hope.
I was muted. Thank you, Constanze. I think we move over to Niklas, and then I have another round of questions before we close this session. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting debate. On this Plan B or Plan A question, I'm not sure I understood it, but if the question is that Plan A is a strong European defense focused on European capabilities, strong European defense fund, permanent structured cooperation, and Plan B is the transatlantic alliance, then I would, and NATO and the security umbrella of the US, then I would urge to argue that we shouldn't put those as like two different options, but should think them together as part of the same a solution, and think about how we, with these European initiatives that are going on, like the Defense Fund, like PESCO, how we ensure that we contribute as Europeans to the one side of NATO, to the European security, to the European pillar of NATO, and don't see this as alternatives. And I think this is also appreciated on the US side, that if the Europeans are able to provide more capabilities. And I think we saw in recent years, we think about the Finnish Council presidency of the EU, where they were really strong about allowing pushing for third-party participation in the permanent structured cooperation, for example. Sweden was in favor of that as well. I think this idea was thought from both sides, right? Having a strong EU component, but allowing the US also to participate. And I think with this announcement of the US that they want to join the PESCO project on military mobility, this is a very practical element where you can see that these actually can work together in the best way. I'm not sure about Constance's point about the desire still in some European capitals to become a greater Switzerland. I think that is a little bit an idea that was there maybe 5, definitely 10 years ago, but which is not so strong anymore. And I think that is where this European strategic autonomy debate comes in. I think, when it comes to positioning itself towards Russia, there have been strong moves when it comes to sanctions. When it comes to China, There is this awareness also in Berlin that it's not only about trade, but there are security implications of direct investment, for example. And when it comes to the US, the Europeans, right after the election of Biden, they made a big offer of talking on, of establishing a technology council, for example, and talk also on trade issues together again. So clearly not positioning the EU as something that is floating between China, Russia, and the US is kind of, has this equidistance, but actually showing where it wants to position itself geopolitically. So I would push back a little bit on this idea of a greater Switzerland still, that this is still a dominant idea. I think I leave it at that and allow some questions.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And I'll do like this. We have about 6 or 7 minutes left. So I'm going to read up 2 or 3 questions, and you can make a strategic and autonomous choice of what to answer. Starting here from Mark Reinhardt. A recent issue of international security argued that Europe will never achieve strategic autonomy for 2 reasons: differing threat perspectives and low material capacity, essentially spending. So how does Sweden contribute to help rectify A and or B? And I guess you can widen that question to Germany or Finland or whatever country you feel that you're close to. That was the first question. A second question is about China. Should the EU use its strategic autonomy more in our trade relations with China? And I guess then establish more of an autonomous line, especially in relation to the US when it comes to managing China. And then I have a final question, perhaps more to Hans, and that was both Constance and Nicholas discussed the issue of kind of weaponized interdependence and a geoeconomic turn. And I wonder if the EU starts to use its kind of economic instruments more at the service of this strategic autonomy. For example, there's much talk about using the common currency, the euro, in a more kind of foreign policy way. How would that affect Sweden, that is a non-member in this field? Would we be even more kind of peripheral in those discussions as the euro gains more of a geopolitical role? That's some questions for you. And I think, who wants to start? Maybe Hans, you want to have a first go?
Thank you, Björn. Well, I'm not sure that the EU itself can decide how strong the euro should be as an instrument in the international affairs. I mean, this depends on so many other factors, and there may be some wishful thinking in Frankfurt or elsewhere about how this could be a more dominant world currency. I'm not sure that this is in the hands of the European leaders. We are pleased with following the advice of our citizens not to take part in the euro cooperation, but we are equally pleased to applaud everything that the eurozone does in order to make it function better and better, because we are extremely dependent on our exports and our trade with the eurozone countries. So there is no doubt about our view there. On the first question on threat perceptions, on their difference, well, I'm not a member of the Foreign Affairs Council, but I listen carefully to discussions, of course, in the General Affairs Council, and I'm pretty familiar with the discussions in the European Council. And I think the threat perceptions they are not wider now. I mean, they don't differ more now than they used to. I'm very glad, for example, that we have had a rather united stand on Russia for many years now. There's always talk before meetings of the European Council that now some member states they think it's time to get out of the sanctions with the Russian Federation on the Federation. That doesn't happen these days. And of course, the latest developments in Ukraine and with the Navalny affair has tightened the cohesion, I would say, among European countries in their view of Russia, I think. When it comes to our capabilities, we are certainly seeing in this country, in Sweden, a very strong enforcement of our military capabilities during the past 5 years or so, and I don't think we have anything to be ashamed of there. And there was one question in the middle that I forgot now.
That was on China and to what extent Europe should use its strategic autonomy or take a more autonomous stance on China.
No, I think we need to work together on this. I mean, the whole issue of industrial subsidies that is being used by China is preferably handled by the WTO in a multilateral setting, and I hope that will be the best way. Otherwise, you know, I understand there is some trilateral work done by China with the United States and Japan that should also be encouraged. But if there is no multilateral solution, I think the EU may very well have to act on its own, and the Commission has some work ongoing on this. There may be some proposal later in the spring, but of course, an instrument here must be very, very precise, and it must play with a future more multilateral regulated framework here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans Dahlgren. And over to Niklas to answer any of these questions. But we only have a few minutes left, so please be brief and pick your favorite.
Sure. So about this argument that the EU will never be strategic autonomous, I haven't read the article, but I would assume that it's mainly focused on the traditional military security interpretation of strategic autonomy. And there, of course, when it comes to the material capacity of the EU and the ability to defend itself, it's very much reliant on NATO or on the transatlantic security umbrella. Thinking about also nuclear umbrella, thinking about conventional forces. I think that there should be no doubt about it that we're not yet at any stage to be strategic autonomous. Also, when we think about crisis management capabilities, there's a long way to go to be able to contain a crisis like we saw in Libya, for example, on our own. So, but that is where some of these initiatives are currently going on. On threat perceptions, then, I think I would agree with Minister Dahlgren that they have moved closer in the last maybe 10 years as a result of the crises, for example, the Ukraine crisis, and also the recent threat analysis exercise during the European Strategic Compass has actually shown that all member states very much agreed on this common document, which was prepared by the intelligence services. So it's not less about maybe always about what kind of threats are the perception, but how to go about it, what instruments to use. Is it diplomacy? Is it sanctions? What's the attitude towards the use of force? I think the strategic cultures between EU member states are still very much distant from each other. Like one final word on China. I think the EU, one has to acknowledge, is in a different position than the US when it comes to China, just because the trade relationship is so close and so important. One just has to look at the German automotive industry and how dependent they are on their China business. So this has to be part of the conversation as well, and we cannot be probably as confrontational as the US can be, because they have just a different tie towards China. But that's just a small point. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Niklas. And over to Constance for a final reply and word here. So you get the chance to close this panel, actually.
So just very briefly, look, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I am not against European autonomy. In fact, I am very strongly for the European Union realizing that its power assets, trade, regulatory, standard setting capabilities make it a peer power to the United States at a time when that form of power is particularly important in an age, again, of weaponized interdependence. However, it is a power that we can only deploy when we act cohesively and don't let ourselves be divided. The Trump administration was an administration that did quite a lot of work to divide us. Right now, it's Moscow and Beijing doing that. Where I'm going to disagree with Niklas is that I talk to Berlin quite a lot, and I think the Greater Switzerland temptation is alive and well there. I mean, yes, threat perceptions have changed considerably. And I think, in fact, that on both what the Russians are doing and the Chinese are doing, the mood has shifted away from the chancellery. It is the chancellery that is the holdout. Yeah. But what I want to what I want to warn against more generally is in a sort of an over-ambitious definition of European autonomy that suggests that neutrality is an option. That is incorrect. And if anybody believes that, that is actually a choice. And it's choosing the other side of this. It is choosing to expose yourself to authoritarian powers in ways that end up not being very good for Europe's strategic autonomy. That's my concern. So I think, in other words, what we have to balance out is a conception of autonomy which gives us greater freedom of action because we improve our resilience, our capability of action, and our internal cohesiveness. But where at the same time, we make sure that we stand shoulder to shoulder with the Americans on the issues that we care about, because we need them for that. And conversely, that gives us the leverage to occasionally tell the Americans, here we will agree to disagree, and we expect you to respect that. Right? That's what a grown-up European Union ought to do, and I think we're still a ways away from that. Thank you very much for inviting me to this. It was a lot of fun. And again, I wish I was in Sweden personally, but I hope that at some point that will be possible again.
Next time, hopefully very soon. We're slightly over time. I think this was an excellent discussion. It's clearly we will keep on discussing these issues, both how Europe will kind of gain perhaps the freedom to act, but also the capacity to act, but also to establish constructive relations with other actors. You've been extremely generous with your time and insights and comments. And to Hans Dahlgren, the minister, I say good luck with formulating a Swedish perspective on these issues. It will be much needed, and especially when we move forward towards the Swedish presidency coming up. I'm sure this is an issue that will be very live at that point. So with that said, thank you very much, all of you, for coming to this panel. I have I don't know how many, lots of questions here that are still not answered, but that's just excellent food for thought for our coming work on this theme. So with that said, thank you very much again, and I hope to see all of you back here at the Institute, and hopefully not only in a digital sense quite soon. So thanks and bye.
Cheers, bye-bye. Good to see you all.